Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books on some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. The Protestant Reformation rejected central Catholic beliefs and practices regarding the nature of revelation, justification, and the sacraments. The general contention was, and continues to be, that such beliefs and practices have no foundation in biblical revelation and are even contrary to it. The Catholic Church has addressed these issues authoritatively and definitively, most notably in the Council of Trent and the Second Vatican Council. Nevertheless, many must address Protestant objections to the Catholic faith at a personal level, whenever they are raised by a friend, relative, colleague, missionary, or group. Oftentimes, they may not be sure how to answer them. Some might even begin to suspect that their objections are sound. At the same time, some Protestants are questioning the validity of the same objections and wondering whether they should become Catholics. Those grappling with these issues will often feel the need to study the biblical, theological, and historical grounds for the contested Catholic teachings. Catholic Apologetics gathers the evidence and outlines the argument systematically. In this interview, Trent selects and discusses 5 books of apologetics that can help those grappling with Protestant objections to the Catholic faith. Trent is a staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers and adjunct professor of apologetics at Holy Apostles College. He specializes in teaching Catholics to graciously and persuasively engage those who disagree with them. He can be heard on the radio program Catholic Answer Live and on his own podcast, The Council of Trent. He has written for the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly and is the author of 9 books, including Answering Atheism, The Case for Catholicism, and Why We're Catholic: Our Reasons for Faith, Hope, and Love. The books discussed in this episode are, first, Catechism of the Catholic Church, issued under Pope John Paul II. Second, The Case for Catholicism, Answers to Classic and Contemporary Protestant Objections by Trent. Third, The Writings of the Apostolic Fathers. Fourth, Teaching with Authority, How to Cut Through Doctrinal Confusion and Understand What the Church Really Says, by Jimmy Akin. And fifth, Pope Peter, Defending the Church's Most Distinctive Doctrine in a Time of Crisis, by Joe Heschmeyer. Links to these books can be found in the show notes of this episode. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Trent, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
What is apologetics?
Apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which means give a defense, typically in a court of law. Apologetics is in general about giving a defense of something, but when we're talking about the faith, it is a subset of theology that is dedicated to giving a rational defense of the Catholic faith. So, there are apologists for any kind of position, but in Catholicism, apologetics is the branch of theology dedicated to giving a rational defense of the faith.
Theology is a science, and if apologetics is a subfield of theology, presumably it too is a science and relies exclusively on rigorous argumentation. To some extent, however, it is also an application of the art of rhetoric, where one selects the reasons most likely to persuade the addressee. Is apologetics a bit of both, part science and part rhetoric?
I think it depends on the focus of the one who is engaged in apologetics. So there can be those who do apologetics and maybe they publish in peer-reviewed journals or academic books, and they're focused primarily on answering arguments and objections, mounting forth evidences for the faith. And they just put forward these arguments, these compilations of different evidences. And so they may be focused more on the accumulation of knowledge. But I think for many people who engage in apologetics, especially for lay people who are talking to friends and family, people who do debates online, rhetoric is a very important part of it, that is similar to evangelism, that evangelism is not just what you say, but it's how you say it. Similar to apologetics, you have to appeal to people's sense of understanding for ethos, pathos, and logos, for authority, emotion, and for logical argumentation.
Where does apologetics fit into the broader sweep of evangelization and catechesis?
Well, I would say that apologetics is certainly not identical to evangelism or catechesis. You can evangelize someone. Evangelism is just sharing the good news of salvation through Jesus Christ and his church. So, excuse me, that is what evangelism is. And catechesis is the greater instruction of those who have been evangelized. Catechesis means literally to sound down, to build a foundation for the person who's accepted the good news about faith in Jesus Christ and his church. So in some of those cases, you can catechize. That apologetics is teaching people, hey, here's what the church teaches. Evangelism here is the gospel. But in some cases, people will have objections. They may have an objection to the gospel, or in the process of catechesis, they may have a question. A church teaching may not seem to make sense to them, or they may have heard arguments against it from non-Catholics. And so in that format, apologetics serves to complement what we do with evangelization and catechesis.
Particularly since Vatican II, the Catholic Church has encouraged ecumenical dialogue. Some, therefore, may suspect that making the case for the Catholic faith to convert Protestants rather than to defend one's own faith is triumphalist, runs contrary to the spirit of ecumenism, and no longer has a place in the Church. Do you agree with this contention?
No, I strongly disagree with that. The council never condemned apologetics in the sense of providing reasons for one to believe in the Catholic faith, whether you provide those reasons for a Catholic to reassure them in their faith, or provide those reasons to a non-Catholic to encourage them to fully embrace the faith of the church. Pope Francis and others have, and Pope Benedict as well, have condemned proselytism. They have condemned the use of manipulative tactics in the process of evangelization. So using coercive tactics or dishonest tactics to help to encourage people to become Catholic. That's something that has been condemned. But apologetics can be done in a triumphal and obnoxious way, but it can also be done in a way in the spirit of ecumenism. So, for example, Catholics and Lutherans have made great strides since the Reformation and even since the Second Vatican Council in finding more common ground on the doctrine of justification by faith. Even Pope Benedict XVI said the formula justification by faith alone can be valid if faith is not divorced from charity, as Paul says in Galatians 5:6. So that would be an example of ecumenism. Ecumenism brings a Catholic and a non-Catholic party closer together, but never fully together. Apologetics helps to bridge that final gap between the two.
Obviously, one should make the case for the Catholic faith, not just with conviction, but also with modesty, charity, and a spirit of prayer, without being pushy, overbearing, or arrogant. However, St. Peter tells us to give a reason for the hope that is in us to those who ask. 1 Peter 3:15. Should we only ever defend the Catholic faith to those who ask, or sometimes take the initiative?
Well, I think that we certainly should take the initiative, but we don't have to start off with an argument. What we can do when engaging a non-Catholic is to just ask them questions. What do you think about God? Who do you think Jesus Christ is or was from their perspective? What do you think of the Catholic Church? What do you think the Bible, the Catholic Church contradicts the Bible? Why do you think that? And in doing this, we're not being antagonistic. We're taking the initiative, but we're not proselytizing. We're not browbeating. We're just asking questions and getting the other person to rethink their worldview.
Traditionally, Catholic theologians have distinguished between three stages of apologetics, depending on whether one is addressing atheists, non-Christian religions, or separated Christian brethren. There's the task of demonstrating the truth of religion, demonstratio religiosa, then that of demonstrating the truth of Christianity, la demonstratio Christiana, and finally, the truth of Catholicism, demonstratio Catholica. Addressing Protestant objections falls within this last stage. Nevertheless, there are doctrinal differences between each of the main Protestant denominations. An Anglican, for example, does not share all the Presbyterians' objections to Catholicism, and vice versa. Moreover, we know that the main objections regard the nature of revelation, justification, and the sacraments. For Protestants, revelation is transmitted through Scripture alone, sola scriptura. We are justified by responding to grace through faith alone, sola fides, and the only priestly mediation between God and man is that exercised by Christ alone, solus Christus. Is this an accurate summary of the main issues, or is one of these issues more fundamental than the others?
Mhm. I think that's an accurate summary. I think the most fundamental issue dividing Catholics and Protestants would be the doctrine of sola scriptura. Even the doctrine of sola fide, we have gained a lot of ground in coming together in an understanding about justification by faith. The Catechism is very clear in paragraph 2010 that man can do nothing to merit initial salvation. When we first receive salvation, there is no work we can do to merit that. It is by grace alone. It's not even by faith. In the sense of, for example, an infant who is baptized does not have their own faith, even though their parents do have faith when they seek baptism for their child. But there is nothing that merits initial salvation. So we can agree with Protestants when they say we are saved by grace alone. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean human beings don't cooperate with God to remain in him and united with him until our final salvation. So I think that that's important to look at. And as I said, sola scriptura, it really is the fundamental dividing point, because Protestants will create a litmus test saying that a doctrine can't be obligatory or maybe even permissible unless it's explicitly found in Scripture. But that's not what Scripture teaches. To use sola scriptura as a means of discerning doctrine leaves one with an incredibly truncated faith, one that's lacking essential elements of the faith, and it leads to contradictory articulations of the faith among various Protestant denominations.
How did you become involved in apologetics?
I became involved in apologetics as a convert in high school. I came to Christianity and then investigated different churches. So I had to answer the objections for myself when I was in high school. Then I volunteered for the youth group that I was a part of and did apologetics there, helping others in their faith. And from there, it was a hobby that I really enjoyed. I did a lot of work on the pro-life movement. And then I was invited to join Catholic Answers in 2012.
3 of your 5 recommended books are fairly recent publications from Catholic Answers. However, there is a centuries-long tradition of Catholic literature that addresses Protestant objections. There are even doctors of the Church, such as St. Francis de Sales and Sir Robert Bellarmine, who wrote notable works. Which books stand out as classics on subjects that are still worth studying, but also accessible to modern readers?
Oh, certainly, there are many. I mean, even going back to the Sheed and Ward Catholic Evidence Guild training outlines, those are very helpful. If you go back even further, what's interesting, even Henry VIII's defense of the seven sacraments, ironically enough, from an Anglican, can be very helpful. As you said before, there are going to be some Protestants who are much closer to Catholics in their theology. And so they can have some important insights in that regard. But yeah, going back, I would say, I believe it's Catholic Controversies by St. Francis de Sales would certainly be a classic there. An essay on the Another one would be Essay on the Development of Doctrine by Cardinal Henry Newman. I think is an invaluable resource. The works that I chose for the 5 books today, while I think those classic works are very important, I would recommend studying those after one derives a foundation using more contemporary works. Although I do have one very classic work in here in the list that I will share. Because the newer works are able to respond to the newest challenges, and some of the older works, such as by Newman or de Sales or Bellarmine, sometimes it can be difficult to parse the precise argument being made if you're unaware of the historical context. So I think for a new reader into apologetics, it can be an interesting read for sure, but it can be difficult to form a coherent response to Protestantism. I think it's good to build a foundation with more contemporary works and then enrich the foundation going to these other classic works later.
Top of your book list is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Have you recommended it because knowing the Catholic faith is the prerequisite for defending it against Protestant objections?
Yes, that's why it's interesting. That's the number one book I recommend people who want to engage in apologetics and defense of the faith. 80% of the apologetic work that I do with Protestants is not answering an objection. It is clearing up a misconception that a person has about Catholicism. And so if one studies the catechism, then they have a firm understanding of what the church does teach and what the church does not teach. And so in doing that, they're able to say, well, no, Catholics, do not believe that we are justified by works as if we have to do a good work in order to be saved. The catechism is very clear. We receive salvation by grace alone. The only work we must do after receiving salvation by grace alone is to not die in a state of mortal sin, to not abandon God. And if we do that, to return to God and seek reconciliation with him in the church. And there's a whole host of other issues that come up. And by reading the catechism, one can explain to people, no, the church does not teach this, it teaches this. The catechism also has many paragraphs in small print that actually serve as either historical analyses or even apologetic treatments in and of themselves. The catechism contains a fair amount of apologetic literature answering objections that are often brought up to various Catholic doctrines. So to me, that would be the prerequisite. If you want to engage in Catholic apologetics, you must know the faith well. Tied with the catechism would be the New Testament. Knowing the New Testament and being able to quote scripture is invaluable for one to do apologetics. If one just spent a year studying the New Testament and the catechism, they would be doing quite well.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.